Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Lobt, Gott, Christen, allzugleich, which translates to praise God, you Christians, all together. All things considered, fairly straightforward chorale. We do have one interesting section here in the second system, but other than that, really the chorale is fairly straightforward, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have one sharp in the key signature. We start on G major. We end on G major. I'm going to hedge my bets and say that we're in the key of G major. After our one chord, we have F sharp, we have A, we have D, and we have another D here, which is D major over F sharp. That's 5/6, passing tone in the alto. Then we have D, A, F sharp, and D, which is just taking our 5 chord and putting it in root position. B is a non-chord tone. C is a little neighboring 7th. That takes us to G, B, G, and D. It's our tonic triad in root position. Passing tones in the lower voices. And then we have B, G, G, and D. And even though this looks like a tonic triad in first inversion, this F natural leads me to believe that the chord is actually functioning differently than just our tonic. I think this is in fact 5/6 of 4, just because the F natural, the lowered 7th scale degree, tends to imply dominance of 4, so coincidentally both the tonic and the dominant of the subdominant are the same chord. So I think you can call this 1/6, you could call it 5/6 of 4. I think they're both accurate. I think just with this F natural in the picture, 5/6 of 4 is a little bit more accurate, in my opinion. And that's further justified by the fact that we go to 4. Also, F is a passing 7th. G is our root, so we don't need to mark it. C, G, E, and E, which is our 4 chord C major. And as we're getting ready for our first cadence, which is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, this G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We have D, D, F sharp, and D. Our 5 chord, 3 roots, and 1/3, kind of an interesting spelling for a 5 chord actually. Passing 7th in the melody. And then we go to G major, G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, root position. Kind of uncommon to see 4, 5, 1 as a chord progression that we see in an authentic cadence. Just a root position 4 chord to a root position 5 chord to a 1 chord. We typically see 2/6. But yeah, we're seeing 4 here in place of 2/6. Next phrase is in the key of D major, ends in a perfect authentic cadence. We start things off with D major over F sharp. We have F sharp, D, A, and A. It's 5/6 in the key of G, and it's 1/6 in the key of D. That takes us to E, G, G, and B. You could call this a 2 chord, E minor. I think actually this B is an accented non-chord tone. It's actually the C sharp that's the root of our chord, which would make this 7/6. However, actually, kind of related to the progression that we have here in our penultimate phrase, which I'll talk about when we get there. We don't go to 1, which is where we would expect to go. We actually go to 6. So we have a deceptive progression on this, or a deceptive variation on this progression that we have expectations for based on Bach's harmonic vocabulary in the chorales. Typically we see 1/6, 7/6, 1, or the retrograde 1/7/6, 1/6. But here Bach is taking us not to 1, but to 6. We have B, we have D, F sharp, and D, so that's B minor in root position 6 with some passing tones in the lower voices. That takes us to G, B, E, and D. E minor 7 over G. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. A, E, and C sharp. That's our 5 chord, A major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, D, and D. Second D major chord with 3 roots and a 3rd. In terms of the way that it's spelled, might be a coincidence, but it's kind of interesting that it's ended up working out that way. We're moving back to the key of G major for the next cadence, or really for the next phrase in its entirety. We end with a half cadence. So we start the phrase off, and because we have this C natural, it's pretty clear that we've modulated, or we're using this chord to modulate. We start off with another D major chord, D, D, F sharp, and D. Again, 3 roots and a third. Kind of interesting that it's happening here over a D major chord again in the key of G major. This is also our 5 chord in root position, passing 7th in the tenor. And then we have G, B, G, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. So let's say first position, I meant root position. We have passing tones in the lower voices. We then have B, D, F sharp, and B. Kind of an interesting progression that we do see from time to time, where instead of going from 1 to 1, 6, which 3 of the voices would lead you to believe, sometimes we go to 3. Sometimes Bach goes to 3. And in this case, Bach further develops this progression by subdividing it and introducing A and C natural into the mix, which, if you take it into context with what's going on in the upper voices, we have F sharp and we have D, making this a 5-4-3 chord in passing. Really, it's more just like a 5-7 chord. Inversions aren't super important in comparison to when we see them used on the harmonic rhythm, but 3 going to 5-4-3 in particular, because of how the bass movement works, is a particularly normative progression. But that's going to take us to 1 like we would expect. G, B, G, and D. G major. We also have some passing tones in the upper voices. We have a couple of C's and we have an A. It's kind of like a passing 2-4-2 chord, but we don't have all the context, so I'm not going to analyze it. We then have G, D, B, and B. No need to reanalyze, that's still a tonic triad in root position. We have A, we have D, we have A, and we have C, which is kind of an interesting chord. It's like a 5-4-3 chord without the F sharp. So again, I'm not really going to analyze it, but we definitely have context here to hear this as a passing dominant chord. But Bach is going to reiterate another tonic triad here, B, D, G, and D, which is our tonic triad this time in first inversion. The reason why I reiterated the Roman numeral here, unlike here, for instance, where we have multiple chords that share a Roman numeral, is because of the fact that it's on a new line. That's more of just like a stylistic thing that I do more than anything else. But you don't need to include it in your analysis. You could just change the figure bass when you break a line. Doesn't really make too much of a difference. Then after our 1-6 chord, passing tone in the melody, C, E, G, and B. That is C major 7 in root position, 4-7. Kind of an interesting half cadential chord. Again, seeing 4 in a cadential context, or a cadential context. F sharp is a passing tone, E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and that takes us to D major. D, A, F sharp, and A. 5 chord. Something I haven't mentioned in a while is that it's typical for half cadences to have the 5th of the chord in the melody. Just maybe it's coincidental, but it tends to be the note that is in the melody when we have half cadences the majority of the time. Not always by any means, but the majority of the time. In Bach's harmonic writing, that is. Onwards to our interesting phrase. Our penultimate phrase is quite interesting. We end in a half cadence in the key of A minor, which is not a very interesting place to go, but the fact that we cadence on a fully diminished 7th chord instead of a 5-7 chord or just a 5 chord in general is pretty interesting. But regardless, we start the phrase off still in the key of G major. B, B, F sharp, and D. And so we're going from 5 to 3 here, kind of being used as a sub for G major with a passing 7th here in the tenor. Next we're going to E, G, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion, which is kind of being used as a substitute for E minor, or sorry, it is for E minor. 3 typically wants to go to 6, and the lower voices would have you believe that you were going to E minor, but this C in the melody is just the difference between E minor and C major. They're very close to one another in terms of their pitch content, and in terms of their function. So here we are seeing them used interchanged. Passing tone here in the tenor, E, B, G, and B. That's technically taking our chord right there and turning it into the 6th chord right here. And that takes us to, when we see 3 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, that's typically an indication that there is a subdivided chord progression, but it is an interesting one. We have D, D, F sharp, and B, which is E minor in first inversion, 3/6. So some transitive harmony here. Something makes me feel like the C is sort of operating like a suspension of sorts, but it, the C major in first inversion versus E minor, it's kind of just like a contrapuntal situation here where the chords sort of coincide with one another. They're very similar in terms of their functions. But yes, 3/6 is going to take us to C, E, E, and A, which is A minor in first inversion 2/6. And this could be the point in which we start the modulation process. I think this is like the earliest point, but I don't think that it happens this early, namely because this A minor feels like it's part of a greater G major progression. A is a chord tone that takes us to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, 2/6 going to 5. C is our chordal 7th. Bach leaps up a minor 7th here, and then we go to G major, B, D, G, and G, which is 1/6. And here's the strange part of this chord progression. We definitely end in a half cadence in the key of A minor, but what exactly is happening here on this chord? A is a passing tone, and then we have A, C, F sharp, and B. So that's not really an analyzable harmony on its own because we have B. It's sort of like a B minor 7 chord, but instead of B we have C. There's lots of different ways that we could frame it, but I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and really this C is the 5th of this chord, which would make this F sharp diminished over A, which would be 7/6. And similar to the progression that we had here, where we're going from 1/6 to 7/6 in the key of D major, and then we're sort of faked out. 7/6, I think, is the point where we very quickly pivot to the key of A minor, because this last chord here is very curious. So I think that at least my justification for what's happening here is lies in the altos line. We have G natural, we have F sharp, and then we have F natural. And when in concert with the bass, where we see the A and the G sharp, it kind of feels like the composite of everything that's going on here is A melodic minor. In some of the chorales that we've been looking at recently, we've been seeing Bach use chromatic movement to sort of intersperse melodic minor and a regular, just natural minor scale that's derivative of the major scale, right? We have, in this case, in A minor, we have the F sharp and the G sharp, but we also have the G natural and the F natural. So the fact that they're both coinciding, it's there are lots of different ways to interpret it, but sort of this chromatic minor sound. I do think that this F sharp minor is a feasible point for us to say that a modulation is happening. It's not about really right or wrong in this case. It's that we have a very out of the ordinary cadence here. It's definitely a half cadence in terms of the chord that we arrive on, but it's kind of quick in terms of how we get there. And I think either the G major chord as a more stable sort of subtonic 7th sound leading into this chord here is valid, or maybe even earlier. But yeah, it's an unusual progression. It almost feels like the cadence stops at a point where it would make more sense for Bach to tonicize the 2 chord and then continue into an authentic cadence or even a half cadence. But we stop on the chord that we would see in a context of tonicization. But I do think we go to A minor very briefly here. And this F sharp diminished chord over A is being used as a pivot between G major and A minor. It's now our diminished 6th chord, which is a byproduct of raising the 6th scale degree of A minor. And then afterwards we move to 7, G sharp, B, F, and D. And there are some versions of this chorale that have been printed with a 5 chord here, where we have E and we have G sharp going on at the same time, but this is the version that I decided to go with because it's what's printed in the collection that I have been sourcing the chorales from for several months now, and it has not done me any wrong. So here we have G sharp, fully diminished 7th, very fascinating chord to end on, to end a phrase on. I don't think I've encountered a half cadence that has had anything other than a 5 chord. Sometimes we see them inverted, but I'd say that would be the most unusual context that I've seen so far. But we have this chromatic line here from G technically to E here, and this F natural is really interesting. But yeah, we're going to continue through this tonicization of A, which will eventually lead us back to G major. So here we have G sharp again, we have B, we have E this time, and we have D. So really I feel like this makes a little bit more sense as a cadential chord rather than this, but probably has something to do with the text setting as well, in terms of like what this chord is symbolizing, or what imagery it's evoking. But this is E7 over G sharp, which is 5-6-5, and really F natural versus E is the difference between these two chords, so they're very similar to one another. Typically I go on about, I usually talk at length about 7 going to 5 as a progression, but in this case they're not happening in the same phrase. This is a separate idea, and the chords are very similar to one another, and it's usually this context here where 3 of the voices are the same and one voice is made different by a half step, and they both function the same way, which is typically what happens when you take a chord and shift one of its voices by a step. But anywho, 5-6-5 takes us to 1, A minor, A, C, E, and C. So it's our tonic in A minor, and with F sharp going to G natural, it doesn't really feel like A melodic minor anymore when it's going up this way. I think this is taking us to the key of G, and it's now our 2 chord. These passing tones in the inner voices leave us with another 5 chord, A, D, F sharp, and C, which in this case would be another 5-4-3 chord like we saw earlier. That takes us to E, E, G, and B, which is E minor, another deceptive progression, very common for Bach to lead into a cadence with a 2-5-6 or even just a 5-6 that will then lead us via the cycle of falling fifths to 2-5 and then 1. So let's see if that happens. We have passing tones in the lower, passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the alto. We then have C, E, E, and A, which is A minor over C, 2-6. We know that Bach loves 2-6 or 2-6-5 chords in cadential contexts especially. A is a chord tone, C is a chord tone as well, E and A. It's actually very briefly taking our chord and putting it in root position, so I'll mark that there. We then have D, A, F sharp, and A. It's our 5 chord. We have very similar sort of cadential or progression similar to what we saw here with this rising 6-7, or no, in this case it's 3-4. 3-4 scale degree here with the 6th of the 5 chord and the 7 of the 5 chord as well. It's a little neighboring 7th figure here, but it's a non-chord tone in this context, the way that I'm analyzing it. And our final perfect authentic cadence ends with G major like we would expect. G, B, D, and G, which is a very typical end to an otherwise kind of quirky chorale based on this little progression going on here. But other than that, that is all I want to talk about regarding today's chorale harmonization. I guess the bigger takeaways are the fact that we have diminished half cadence here, which is pretty interesting, and our tonic being used as 5-4. That's something that I've been tracking for my own, just my own data over all of my time analyzing the chorales. But other than that, really the chorale is fairly straightforward, so I think I'm going to cap the video off on that note. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis. and I hope you take care.